My sister raised her crystal champagne flute at our family dinner and told me to stop playing pretend entrepreneur because my little online lotion thing was not a real business. The whole table erupted in laughter. I just nodded and quietly said, "Understood." They had no idea that on Thursday morning I would email my investment firm to pull the $188 million anchor fund from her failing tech startup. Before I share exactly how I legally and ruthlessly dismantled my sister's fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been the family scapegoat who quietly outgrew them all. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the massive formal dining room of my parents' sprawling Atlanta estate. It was our monthly Sunday dinner, a tradition my mother Vivian guarded with her life. The table was set with her finest china, and the room was filled with about 20 extended family members, including a few prominent elders from our church. Everything in my parents' world was about image reputation and maintaining the illusion of generational wealth. I sat near the end of the table nursing a glass of sparkling water. I am Chloe, 35 years old, and according to my family, I am the resident cautionary tale. My younger sister Isabella stood at the head of the table next to our father Jerome. She was 32, wearing a tailored designer suit that screamed corporate success. Isabella was the CEO of a highly publicized tech startup called AuraSync. She was the golden child, the Stanford graduate, the pride and joy of the family. Isabella tapped her spoon against her champagne flute, demanding everyone's attention. The room fell silent. She smiled her perfect camera-ready smile and began to speak about her company, about breaking barriers in the tech industry, and about setting the standard for our family. Everyone beamed at her. My parents looked like they might burst with pride. But Isabella could never just enjoy her own spotlight. She always needed to cast a shadow over me to make herself shine brighter. She turned her gaze down the long table until her eyes locked onto mine. Her smile sharpened into a smirk. She raised her glass higher and shifted her tone from celebratory to deeply condescending. She said we all have to strive for greatness and build real legacies. You know, Chloe, you really need to stop playing pretend entrepreneur. Your little online lotion thing is not a real business. You are 35 now. You need a stable paycheck instead of dreaming. The silence that followed was heavy. Then a few cousins chuckled. The chuckle grew into a ripple of laughter across the table. I felt the familiar sting of public humiliation, but I kept my face completely blank. Her husband Connor chimed in right on cue. Connor was a 34-year-old white man who served as the chief financial officer of AuraSync. He leaned back in his chair with that signature smug tech bro arrogance that he always weaponized against me. He let out a patronizing laugh and said, "Chloe, if you want, I can take some time this week to look over your Shopify metrics. Maybe I can help you figure out why your conversion rates are tanking. We could probably optimize your little storefront so you can at least make rent this month." More laughter followed. It was a coordinated attack, a routine they had perfected over the years. My mother Vivian let out a long, dramatic sigh from her seat. She shook her head and looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound disappointment. She said if you had just stayed at Spelman and finished your law degree like Isabella did at Stanford, you would not be peddling shea butter at 35. You had so much potential, Chloe, but you threw it away. Now look at your sister. She is building an empire while you are struggling to sell moisturizer on the internet. My father Jerome just nodded in agreement, slicing into his steak without offering a single word of defense for me. In their eyes, I was the strong black woman who had failed. I was the one who abandoned a prestigious educational path to chase a foolish dream. They saw me as a struggling boutique owner, barely scraping by, desperately needing their pity and advice. What they did not know was that my little online lotion thing had scaled globally and sold to a major cosmetics conglomerate for 9 figures 6 years ago. I did not struggle to make rent. I owned the building they were sitting in, along with a significant portion of the commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta. I was the anonymous private equity billionaire behind Crescent Holdings, and the most delicious secret of all was that Crescent Holdings was the sole anchor investor keeping Isabella's overhyped, heavily bleeding startup from going into immediate bankruptcy. I had funded her through a blind trust out of a misplaced sense of generational loyalty. I wanted to see a Black woman, my own sister, succeed in the tech world. But as I sat there listening to the cruel laughter of my aunts, uncles, and parents, that lingering sense of family loyalty evaporated completely. They wanted to humiliate me to elevate the golden child. They wanted to remind me of my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. They had used me to foot the bill for family emergencies in the past, always claiming Isabella needed her money for her real business while my funds were disposable. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not try to defend my business or scream out the truth about my bank accounts. I simply picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I looked directly into Isabella's smug, triumphant eyes. I offered a calm, gentle smile and said a single word. Understood. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cool liquid wash away the last remaining traces of my guilt. They thought they had put me in my place. They thought they had won the evening. But as I swallowed that water, I was already composing the email in my head to my lead wealth manager, Elias. I was going to let them enjoy their dessert, their laughter, and their fake empire for just a few more days. They had dug their own graves tonight, and I was more than happy to provide the headstone. The ice in my glass shifted with a soft clink. That tiny sound was swallowed immediately by my father clearing his throat. Jerome leaned forward, placing his heavy hands flat on the mahogany table. He wore his Sunday best, a tailored three-piece suit that commanded respect from his church congregation and demanded absolute submission from his daughters. "Chloe, listen to your sister," he said, his baritone voice filling the room. "Isabella is setting the standard. We talk about Black excellence in this house. We talk about generational wealth. Orasync is going to put our family name in the history books. She and Connor are building a legacy. You need to take notes instead of taking offense." I kept my expression carefully neutral. My father always equated academic pedigrees and magazine features with actual value. Because my business was built quietly online without venture capital press releases or a Stanford diploma, he viewed it as a hobby. My mother, Vivian, chimed in right on cue. She reached over and patted Isabella's hand, flashing her a proud smile before turning her critical gaze back to me. "Your father is right, Chloe. We all have to sacrifice for the greater good. Isabella is scaling a massive operation. Her capital is tied up in changing the world. You, on the other hand, have no real overhead. You do not have a mortgage in a gated community. You do not have employees depending on you." Connor took a sip of his bourbon, nodding enthusiastically. "Exactly, Vivian. It is all about liquidity and burn rate. Chloe, since you are just bootstrapping a little e-commerce store, your cash flow is a lot simpler. Isabella and I are managing millions in investor capital. Every penny we have is locked into server expansions and aggressive customer acquisition." I watched Connor swirl his drink. He loved using corporate buzzwords to talk down to me. He loved pretending he was the financial mastermind of the family. My forensic audit team at Crescent Holdings had already told me exactly where Connor's millions in investor capital were actually going. It was not going to server expansions. It was funding offshore cryptocurrency wallets and a very private beach house in the Bahamas. But I kept my mouth shut. The head caterer stepped into the dining room, interrupting the barrage of insults. He walked quietly over to the head of the table, holding a sleek black leather folio containing the bill for the evening. This was not a standard family potluck. Vivian and Jerome had hired a private chef and a full-service catering staff to prepare butter-poached lobster tails, prime rib, and vintage champagne. It was a feast designed to celebrate Isabella's latest press feature. The caterer respectfully placed the leather folio next to Isabella. She did not even open it. Instead, she placed her manicured fingers on top of the leather and slid it straight down the polished mahogany table. The folio stopped exactly in front of my plate. Isabella smiled a sweet, venomous smile that she reserved specifically for me. "You know, Chloe, since my capital is currently tied up in payroll for 50 actual employees, why do not you get this one? Consider it a lesson in financial responsibility." I looked down at the folio. The total printed at the bottom of the receipt was $2,400. My mother clapped her hands together in agreement. What a wonderful idea, Isabella. Chloe, you always seem to have spare cash lying around since you live so frugally. Just like when you paid for your aunt's medical deductible last winter, or when you covered the cabin rental for the family reunion. Contributing to the family might give you a sense of what real investment feels like. I let their words wash over me. The sheer audacity of their logic was breathtaking. They viewed my quiet lifestyle not as a choice but as a lack of ambition. Because I did not flaunt designer bags or drive a leased luxury car, they assumed my money was disposable. For years, they had treated me as the family mule expected to quietly absorb the financial hits for family emergencies and lavish dinners while they showered Isabella with praise and investment funds. They believed I was desperate enough for their love that I would gladly empty my modest bank account just to sit at their table. I looked at Connor, who was smirking. I looked at my parents, who were watching me with expectant, demanding eyes. Finally, I looked at Isabella. She sat at the head of the table, practically vibrating with self-satisfaction, waiting for me to argue, to cry, or to embarrass myself by admitting I could not afford a $2,000 dinner. I did not argue. I did not flinch. I calmly opened my purse and reached inside. I bypassed my standard credit cards and pulled out a solid metal card. It was heavy, unmarked, and entirely black. It carried no spending limit and was issued only to private wealth clients with assets exceeding $50 million. I placed the heavy metal card on top of the receipt and handed the folio back to the waiting caterer. I locked eyes with my sister. My voice was steady, quiet, and completely void of emotion. Understood. Isabella's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She did not recognize the type of card I had just used, but the sheer weight of it hitting the folio made her blink. Connor frowned slightly, his eyes tracking the caterer as he walked away. They expected a struggle. They expected me to beg for a split bill. My immediate frictionless compliance unnerved them. I smoothed my skirt and stood up from the table. "Thank you for the dinner," I said, my tone perfectly polite. It was highly educational. I walked out of the dining room, leaving the echo of my footsteps against the marble floor. I did not look back. I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night and got into my car. The moment the doors locked, I pulled out my phone and opened my secure email client. The time for playing the silent, supportive sister was officially over. I typed out the message to Elias, my lead wealth manager at Crescent Holdings. Initiate the withdrawal clause. Pull the $188 million anchor fund from Orasync effective immediately. I hit send. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the estate gates, leaving my family behind to enjoy their final weekend of fake luxury. The earthquake was coming for them by Thursday morning. The heavy oak doors of my parents' estate closed behind me, shutting out the sound of their self-satisfied laughter. I stood on the sprawling brick driveway for a moment, letting the humid Atlanta air wash over my skin. The valet brought my sensible mid-sized sedan around a vehicle I specifically kept to maintain the illusion of my modest life. I tipped him, handed him a crisp $20 bill, and slid into the driver's seat. The moment the door clicked shut, the posture I had held all evening completely dissolved. The mask of the quiet, struggling sister, the family scapegoat, the woman who needed their unsolicited business advice, fell away entirely. I gripped the leather steering wheel and let out a long, slow breath. They really thought I was still peddling shea butter from my living room. They truly believed my life was a cautionary tale of a black woman working too hard for too little return. They wanted me to be the strong black woman who carried everyone else's burdens without complaint. It is a dangerously familiar role in our community. The woman who absorbs the trauma, pays the bills, and sits quietly in the corner while the chosen golden children take the glory. My mother, Vivian, had spent her entire life curating a flawless image for the church elders and her elite social circles. She needed Isabella to be the shining star to prove her own success as a mother. I was just the necessary contrast, the dark background that made Isabella shine brighter. It was almost comical how easily they accepted the narrative that I was a failure simply because I chose not to broadcast my success. 6 years ago, I did not just build an online storefront. I built a comprehensive skincare empire tailored specifically for women of color, utilizing proprietary organic formulas that disrupted the entire beauty industry. It grew so fast and so fiercely that within 4 years, a global cosmetics conglomerate made an acquisition offer I could not refuse. I sold the company for a clean 9 figures. I secured my wealth quietly, cleanly, and completely out of the public eye. I did not buy flashy cars to park in my parents' driveway. I did not post my bank balances on social media. Instead, I took my capital and quietly founded Crescent Holdings, a private equity firm that specialized in silent investments. I became the ghost in the machine, the anonymous billionaire backing some of the most lucrative ventures in the country. And unfortunately, one of those ventures belonged to my sister. As I pulled out of the gated community and onto the darkened streets of the city, I thought about why I had done it. Why did I funnel $188 million into AuraSync? It was a question Elias, my lead wealth manager, had asked me repeatedly when I first proposed the blind trust. I had done it out of a misplaced sense of generational loyalty. Despite the constant belittling, the snide comments, and the endless comparisons, I still wanted to see a black woman win in the cutthroat tech space. I wanted that black woman to be my sister. I knew Isabella had the education and the aggressive drive, but she lacked the capital. When her initial funding rounds dried up and the venture capitalists started circling like vultures, I stepped in. I created a maze of shell companies and blind trusts to act as her angel investor. I became the invisible safety net keeping her golden child image intact. I thought I was being noble. I thought I was protecting the family legacy my parents cared so much about. But tonight, sitting at that mahogany table watching them humiliate me for sport, I realized the ugly truth. They did not want a legacy of mutual success. They wanted a hierarchy. They needed me at the bottom so they could feel comfortable at the top. Isabella did not want a sister, she wanted a prop to highlight her own superiority. Connor wanted a punching bag for his fragile corporate ego. My parents wanted a scapegoat to carry the weight of their impossible standards. I navigated the quiet roads leading toward downtown Atlanta, the city lights reflecting off the windshield. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the supportive backbone of a family that only viewed me as dead weight. I had swallowed my pride, paid their bills, and smiled through their disrespect. I had literally bankrolled the very company they were currently using to mock me. The loyalty I had held onto for so long evaporated entirely. It was replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. You cannot protect people who are actively trying to destroy you. You cannot fund the very weapons being pointed at your head. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of my actual residence, a highly guarded luxury high-rise where I owned the top 3 floors. The security detail nodded respectfully as I stepped out of the car. I bypassed the main lobby and took the private elevator directly to my penthouse. The doors opened to panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline shining brightly against the dark night sky. The quiet luxury of my home was a stark contrast to the noisy performative wealth of my parents' estate. Here there was no one to impress, no one to belittle me. Here I was exactly who I had worked so hard to become. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. I did not see a victim. I did not see the quiet sister who had just been bullied into paying a $2,000 dinner tab. I saw the chief executive officer of Crescent Holdings. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the penthouse. I opened my encrypted email application and selected a new draft addressing it to Elias. Elias was brilliant, fiercely loyal, and had been waiting for me to wake up and see my family for who they truly were. He had warned me about AuraSync. He had warned me about Connor. He had begged me to let him conduct a full forensic audit months ago, but I had held him back out of loyalty. There would be no more holding back. My fingers moved swiftly across the digital keyboard. I did not need to write a long explanation. Elias already knew the stakes. I typed out the command with absolute certainty. Initiate the withdrawal clause. Pull the $188 million anchor fund from AuraSync effective immediately. I read the words over once, checking them for any trace of hesitation. There was none. I pressed send. The message vanished into the digital ether, setting into motion a chain of events that would completely decimate my sister's fake empire. By tomorrow morning, the board members would receive emergency notifications. The accounts would be frozen. The artificial safety net I had woven beneath them would be entirely stripped away. I set the phone down on the marble countertop and took a deep breath. For the first time in 35 years, I felt completely untethered from the toxic expectations of my family. I had finally dropped the dead weight. The storm was coming for them, and I was going to watch it hit from the quiet comfort of the penthouse. Thursday morning arrived with the soft hum of automated silk blinds rising to let the bright sunlight flood my bedroom. I stood at my kitchen island, pressing a fresh double shot of espresso. The machine purred quietly, an expensive Italian model that cost more than the car my parents thought I drove. I took a slow sip, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me. There was no rushing today. There was no frantic scrambling to meet shipping deadlines or package inventory. That was the life my family imagined for me. My actual reality was the profound, absolute silence of a high-security minimalist penthouse. The private elevator chimed, echoing softly through the marble foyer. The heavy steel doors parted, and Elias stepped out. At 42, Elias was a masterclass in precision. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that matched his razor-sharp intellect. As the lead wealth manager at Crescent Holdings, he was the architect of my financial fortress. He was also an African-American man who understood the intricate, exhausting dynamics of family expectations and corporate warfare. He had been by my side since I sold my skincare company. He knew every secret, every shell corporation, and every cent of my net worth. Elias walked over to the kitchen island and placed a slim encrypted tablet on the stone counter. He looked at me, his dark eyes completely serious. "The withdrawal notice has been executed," he said, his voice steady and calm. The board of directors at Orasync received the formal declaration at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. The $188 million anchor fund is officially being pulled. They are in a mandatory emergency lockdown. I set my espresso cup down. The ceramic clicked against the marble. "How bad is the panic?" I asked. Elias allowed a small, grim smile to touch his lips. "It is a bloodbath, Chloe. Without our capital backing them, they do not have the liquidity to cover their server hosting costs, let alone their bloated executive payroll. The entire illusion Isabella and Connor built is evaporating in real time. They have 48 hours before the insolvency becomes a matter of public record." We walked over to the sunken living room and sat on the low-profile leather sofas. For a long time, I just stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Atlanta skyline. For 2 years, I had used a blind trust to pump millions into my sister's company. I had watched her grace magazine covers and accept awards funded entirely by my invisible safety net. "I only did it out of a misplaced sense of generational loyalty," I said, breaking the silence. "I wanted to see a Black woman win in the tech industry. I wanted that woman to be my sister. I thought if I provided the capital, she could provide the vision. I thought I was building our family legacy." Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You were trying to be the savior, Chloe. It is a trap we fall into too often in our community. You secure the wealth, and suddenly you feel obligated to carry everyone else across the finish line. But your family did not want a partner. They wanted a mule. They wanted you to stay small, so they could feel big." He was absolutely right. The doctrine of the strong Black woman had been drilled into my head since childhood by my mother. Vivian taught me that endurance was my only currency. I was supposed to endure disrespect, endure financial drain, and endure public humiliation just to keep the family image intact. I had bought into that toxic lie for years. I had hidden my wealth because I knew they would demand it. I had funded Isabella secretly because I knew my parents would never accept that my success dwarfed hers. Elias had tried to warn me. When I first set up the blind trust, he presented a risk assessment that explicitly highlighted Connor as a liability. Elias had sat in on Orasync quarterly review meetings, acting as the proxy for the anonymous trust. He told me how Connor would speak over the women in the room, how he would dismiss solid financial advice with patronizing corporate buzzwords. Connor thought Elias was just a hired suit managing some nameless billionaire portfolio. He had no idea the billionaire was his sister-in-law. He had no idea Elias answered directly to me. I had ignored those warnings because I wanted to protect Isabella. I thought she was the victim of a mediocre white husband. I realized on Sunday that she was not his victim. She was his willing accomplice. That loyalty is dead, I told Elias. Sunday dinner killed whatever was left of my guilt. They want to play high-level corporate games while treating me like a struggling vendor. Let them see what the real game looks like. Elias nodded, his expression filled with deep respect. You made the right call. I have hated watching you protect Connor for the last 2 years. The man is arrogant, incompetent, and completely unqualified to be a chief financial officer. He uses venture capital jargon to mask the fact that Orasync is hemorrhaging users. Our funding was the only thing keeping the lights on. I leaned back against the sofa, feeling a profound sense of peace. The fake struggling sister was dead. The anonymous angel investor was gone. All that remained was the chief executive officer of Crescent Holdings, and I was ready to clean house. Right on cue, a sharp, aggressive buzzing shattered the quiet atmosphere of the penthouse. I looked over at the glass coffee table. It was not my secure corporate device. It was my burner phone. The cheap, outdated model I kept exclusively for family communications to maintain my facade. It vibrated relentlessly, dancing across the glass surface like an angry insect. The screen lit up with a continuous stream of notifications. The buzzing grew louder and more frantic. I watched the screen flash with a barrage of text messages. Isabella was sending paragraphs of pure panic in all caps. My mother was sending prayer emojis and demanding everyone answer their phones. My father was asking what a withdrawal clause meant. The blast radius of my single email had finally reached their gated community in the suburbs. The family group chat was completely melting down. I watched the cheap plastic of my burner phone vibrate furiously against the polished marble countertop. It was a jarring contrast. Everything in my penthouse was custom-built, silent and sleek, but this $50 device was currently having a mechanical seizure. Elias stood on the opposite side of the kitchen island, watching the device with quiet amusement. He took another sip of his espresso, completely unbothered by the digital panic unfolding in front of us. I reached out and picked up the phone. The screen was blindingly bright, displaying a waterfall of frantic notifications. Our family group chat, which my mother had optimistically named the Blessed Blackwells, was in absolute disarray. I scrolled through the messages, letting the chaos wash over me. My mother Vivian was typing paragraphs of desperate prayers. She was calling on the blood of Jesus to protect Isabella and her company, typing out scripture verses about weapons formed against them not prospering. My father Jerome was demanding answers, asking if Connor had contacted the crisis management team and wondering how this would affect their standing at the country club. Then there was Isabella. Her messages were a mess of all caps and frantic typos. She was spiraling. She wrote that the board was threatening to lock her out of the operating accounts and that the media could catch wind of the funding withdrawal by the afternoon. I did not reply to a single message. I just stood there in the quiet luxury of my home, letting them sweat. For years, they had demanded my immediate attention for every minor family inconvenience, expecting me to drop everything to serve them. Today, I was going to make them wait. Suddenly, the screen changed. The group chat notifications vanished, replaced by an incoming call from Isabella. I looked at Elias and gestured toward the phone. He nodded, folding his arms across his tailored suit. I swiped the screen to answer and immediately pressed the speaker button, placing the phone back down on the marble counter. I did not say hello, I just let the line open. Isabella's voice practically shattered the speaker. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air between her words. She said, "Chloe, you need to listen to me right now. I do not have time for pleasantries. We are in a massive crisis." I kept my voice perfectly flat, playing the part of the oblivious sister. I asked her what was wrong. She let out a ragged sob. Our anchor investor just pulled out. Some anonymous coward hiding behind a blind trust just sent a formal withdrawal notice to my board of directors. They are pulling $188 million from Aura Sync. I looked at Elias. He did not even blink. I asked her why an investor would do something so drastic without warning. Isabella screamed into the phone. She said they claimed a misalignment of core values. A misalignment of core values, Chloe. It makes no sense. I am the face of Black excellence in Atlanta tech. I am on the cover of magazines. This is a targeted attack. Someone is trying to destroy my legacy. The irony was delicious. She was begging for sympathy from the very sister she had publicly humiliated just 72 hours ago. But I knew Isabella. I knew she did not call me for emotional support. She called me because she needed something. She took a jagged breath, trying to force her voice into a commanding tone. She said the board is freezing our operating accounts pending an emergency financial review. We cannot make payroll on Friday. If our essential development team does not get paid, they will walk out and go straight to the press. The company will be dead by Monday. I need cash right now to keep the lights on. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool marble. I asked her what any of that had to do with me. She snapped at me, her desperation turning into vicious entitlement. She said, I need you to take out a personal loan. $50,000. Today. Go to your credit union and leverage whatever you have. I know you have good credit because you never buy anything and you live like a monk. I stared down at the phone. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She wanted me, the sister she had just mocked in front of our entire family for being poor and unsuccessful, to take out a predatory loan to save her sinking ship. She assumed I was so desperate for her approval, so thoroughly trained to be the family mule, that I would happily ruin my own credit to plug a hole in her sinking company. I kept my voice dead calm. I told her $50,000 is a lot of money to ask for, Isabella, especially after the way you spoke to me at Sunday dinner. She scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. She told me to get over myself. She said Sunday was just tough love to motivate me. She claimed she was trying to push me to be better, and that I was being overly sensitive during a family emergency. Then she shifted her tactics. When insults did not work, she immediately dug into the past to weaponize guilt. She said, you owe this family, Chloe. Remember senior year of high school? Remember when you took Dad's Lexus without asking and backed it into a light pole? Mom and Dad emptied their savings to pay for the damages in cash, so your insurance would not skyrocket and ruin your clean record. They protected you. They sacrificed for you. Now it is your turn to sacrifice for the family legacy. I remembered that night perfectly. I remembered the crunch of metal and the smell of smoke. I also remembered that I was not the one driving. I was in the passenger seat covering for Isabella, who was completely intoxicated behind the wheel. I took the blame so she would not lose her early admission to Stanford. I absorbed my parents' rage. I worked a minimum wage job for 2 years to quietly pay them back every single cent while Isabella packed her bags for California without a blemish on her record. I had carried her secret for 15 years, and this is how she repaid me. By using my sacrifice as a weapon against me. I leaned close to the microphone on the phone. My voice dropped to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. I told her, I am not taking out a high-interest personal loan to cover your payroll, Isabella. I am not ruining my credit to save your company. Isabella completely lost her mind. She shrieked into the phone, calling me a jealous, bitter failure. She said I was a miserable woman who wanted to see her own sister lose because I had achieved absolutely nothing in my own pathetic life. I let her scream. I let Elias hear exactly who my sister was. Suddenly there was a loud scuffle on the other end of the line. I heard the sharp sound of a phone being snatched away. Isabella's voice faded into the background, replaced by heavy, aggressive breathing filling the speaker. Then Connor's voice cut through the static. It was not frantic or hysterical like Isabella's. It was deep, hostile, and dripping with toxic corporate arrogance. He barked at Isabella to leave the room and shut the door. I heard a door slam. Then he addressed me, his tone vibrating with the kind of smug entitlement reserved for men who believe they own the world. Listen to me very carefully, Chloe. Connor started his voice dropping an octave in a pathetic attempt at intimidation. I know you do not understand high-level corporate dynamics. I know running a little Shopify store out of your living room makes you think you are a business owner, but you are not. You are playing retail. Isabella and I are operating in the major leagues. We are dealing with venture capital board fiduciary duties and global scaling. When an anchor investor pulls out, due to an unforeseen market fluctuation, it requires immediate agile capital injection to stabilize the infrastructure. I reached across the marble island and tapped the record icon on my secure tablet. Let him speak, I thought. Let him dig the trench as deep as he possibly could. You are going to go to your local credit union today, Chloe. He continued, his tone shifting from patronizing to outright aggressive. You are going to take out a $50,000 personal loan. I do not care what interest rate they give you. I do not care if you have to leverage your car or whatever inventory you have sitting in your apartment. You are going to wire that money to our operating account by 3 o'clock this afternoon. Do you understand me? This is what family sacrifice looks like. Isabella carries the weight of your family name. She is the standard. You owe her this. If you do not do this, you are actively destroying Black excellence. The audacity of this mediocre white man weaponizing Black excellence against me in my own penthouse was almost poetic. He was lecturing me about sacrifice. He was explaining business dynamics to the woman who literally owned the very chair he was sitting on in his leased corporate office. He had married into a prominent African-American family and completely co-opted our cultural milestones, using my parents' obsession with status to shield his own incompetence. Are you listening to me, Chloe? He snapped, the sound of his hand slamming against a desk echoing through the speaker. Do not play the victim here. We both know you have always been jealous of Isabella. We both know you dropped out of Spelman and became the family disappointment. Here is your chance to actually be useful. You have achieved absolutely nothing of real value in 35 years. For once in your life, stop being a selfish failure and do what you are told. If you ruin my company because you are too cheap to take out a basic loan, I will personally make sure your parents never speak to you again. I will make sure you are uninvited from every holiday, every dinner, and every event. You will be completely cut off from the only people who still tolerate you. I waited exactly 3 seconds, allowing the heavy silence to stretch across the line. My voice was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of fear. I told him, you do not get to dictate terms to me, Connor. You do not get to demand my money to cover your sheer incompetence. If your company is failing because your anchor investor realized your core values are bankrupt, that is a reflection of your leadership, not my bank account. I will not be liquidating a single asset to save you. Do not ever speak to me about sacrifice again. He let out a sharp, vicious laugh. You are making a massive mistake, Chloe. You have no idea the kind of people Isabella and I deal with. You have no idea the power we hold in this city. You are dead to us. Stay away from the Founders and Faith Gala this weekend. Do not even think about showing your face. You do not fit in with our caliber of people anyway. I pressed the end call button. The line went dead. The silence in the penthouse returned, wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud drive and categorized it under legal evidence. He wanted to talk about the caliber of people. He was about to find out exactly what caliber of person he had just threatened. The private elevator chimed. Elias walked back into the living area, but his usual calm demeanor had shifted into something much more intense. He was not holding his encrypted tablet anymore. He was carrying a thick physical manila folder packed with printed documents and bank statements. It was the kind of file we only pulled when we were preparing for absolute war. Elias bypassed the kitchen and walked straight up to my glass coffee table. He dropped the thick file onto the surface with a heavy, resounding thud. He looked at me, his jaw clenched tight. You are going to want to see this, Chloe, he said, his voice laced with cold fury. I just received the expedited forensic audit from our internal investigations team. We deployed the financial trackers the moment you sent the withdrawal email last night. I looked at the folder, then back up at Elias. I asked him what they found. Elias rested his hands on the table, leaning in close. He said, "Your sister is not just failing. Her husband is stealing." The air in the room seemed to freeze. I reached out and opened the heavy folder. The first page was a comprehensive flowchart tracing the capital from Crescent Holdings directly into Aura Sync operating accounts. But the arrows did not stop there. They splintered off into dozens of dummy corporations, offshore accounts, and untraceable cryptocurrency wallets. Elias pointed to a massive, outgoing wire transfer highlighted in bright red ink. He said Connor has been cooking the books for the last 14 months. He is using high-level corporate jargon at board meetings to mask the fact that he is siphoning venture capital directly into his own pockets. He is bleeding the company dry from the inside out. Your $188 million anchor fund was not going toward server expansions or payroll. It was going toward funding his secret lifestyle. I flipped to the next page. There were property deeds and asset registrations. Connor had purchased a sprawling beachfront estate in the Bahamas entirely in his own name using a shell company registered in Delaware. He had bought luxury vehicles and funded private charter flights, all with my money. He was demanding $50,000 from you today. Elias continued, his tone sharp with disgust, not to pay the development team. The payroll account is completely empty. He needed your $50,000 to cover his tracks for one more weekend so he could finalize his exit strategy. He is preparing to abandon the company and leave Isabella holding the bag for massive federal fraud. I stared at the documents mapping out the sheer magnitude of Connor's betrayal. He had just spent 10 minutes screaming at me on the phone, lecturing me about sacrifice and family loyalty, while actively stealing millions of dollars and setting my sister up for federal prison. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought he could easily manipulate the struggling boutique owner and outsmart the anonymous billionaire keeping them afloat. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. My family wanted to treat me like a struggling vendor. Isabella wanted to use me as a prop to highlight her own superiority. Connor wanted to use me as a final payday before he skipped town. They had absolutely no idea that the safety net they had been abusing had just transformed into a steel trap. I closed the file and looked at Elias. The games were over. I knew they would come looking for me. That is why I did not stay in the penthouse. I drove across town to the industrial district where I leased a small, exposed brick warehouse. This was my decoy office. I maintained this space for a few $1,000s a month just to keep up appearances. It had a couple of packing tables, a modest inventory of shea butter and raw lotions, and a small front desk. It smelled like coconut oil and lavender. It looked exactly like the struggling small business my family believed I ran. I sat behind the cheap laminate desk waiting. I did not have to wait long. Just before noon, a black luxury SUV pulled up outside the roll-up doors. The heavy metal door creaked open and the sharp sound of designer heels echoed against the concrete floor. My mother Vivian walked in first. She wore a tailored cream-colored pantsuit, looking as if she had just stepped out of a high society luncheon. She wrinkled her nose immediately, waving a manicured hand in front of her face, as if the scent of natural oils was offensive to her. My father Jerome followed close behind her, wearing his golf attire, his face set in a deep scowl. Isabella brought up the rear. She looked entirely different from the poised, arrogant woman at Sunday dinner. Her hair was pulled back haphazardly, her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a designer handbag to her chest like a shield. Connor was noticeably absent. Vivian did not offer a greeting. She stopped a few feet from my desk and looked around the warehouse with absolute disdain. She asked how I could spend my days in a dusty garage. I ignored the insult and remained seated, folding my hands calmly on the desk. I asked them what they wanted, knowing exactly why they were standing there. Jerome stepped forward. He used his deepest, most authoritative voice, the one he reserved for disciplining disobedient children. He said, "We are not here to play games, Chloe. Your sister is in a crisis. A real crisis, not some minor inventory delay like you deal with in this warehouse. Her company is facing a cash flow emergency, and we need you to step up and do your part for this family." I looked at Isabella. She refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at a stack of cardboard shipping boxes. I asked where her husband was. I mentioned that Connor had called me just yesterday screaming threats and demanding I ruin my credit to save his sinking ship. Vivian sighed heavily, dismissing my concern with a wave of her hand. She said, "Connor is a man under immense pressure, Chloe. He is dealing with high-level corporate stress that you simply do not understand. Men speak sharply when millions of dollars are on the line. You need to stop being so sensitive and focus on the bigger picture. The bigger picture is our family legacy." She stepped closer to the desk, leaning over to look down at me. Her voice took on a sharp, desperate edge. She said, "I sit on the board of the Ladies' Auxiliary at our church. Your father is a senior deacon. We are pillars of this community. Isabella is the pride of this family. She is the standard of Black excellence in Atlanta. Do you have any idea what it will look like if her company goes under? The gossip will destroy us. The church elders will whisper about us. I will not have my reputation dragged through the mud because you are too stubborn to open your wallet." The sheer toxicity of her words hung in the air. She did not care about Isabella's well-being. She did not care that Isabella was frantic and terrified. Vivian only cared about how this failure would reflect on her at Sunday service. She wanted me to absorb the financial blow strictly to protect her country club status. Jerome crossed his arms over his chest. He said, "We know you have a nest egg, Chloe. You live frugally. You do not have a mortgage in a gated community or a husband to support. We need you to transfer whatever savings you have to Isabella right now. We are talking about preserving generational wealth. You have a duty to this family." I stared at my father. He was lecturing me about generational wealth while demanding I empty my life savings to bail out his favorite daughter. He was asking me to set myself on fire to keep Isabella warm. I turned my attention back to my sister. I asked Isabella exactly how much she needed to keep the doors open. Isabella finally looked up. Her voice was shaky, stripped of all its usual arrogance. She said, "I need $50,000 today to cover the essential development team payroll. If they do not get paid by tomorrow, they will walk out and go to the tech blogs. The media will tear me apart. The board will lock me out of my own company." I let a heavy silence fill the warehouse. I let them stand there in their designer clothes, begging the family's scapegoat for survival money. I thought about the forensic audit sitting on my desk in the penthouse. I thought about the millions of dollars Connor had already stolen and funneled into offshore accounts. They were asking me to drain my supposed life savings to fund the escape plan of a white man who was actively robbing a Black woman blind. Vivian slammed her hand on my desk, breaking the silence. She told me to stop sitting there like a statue. She said, "You are single, Chloe. You have no children. You have no real responsibilities. If you empty your savings, you can always rebuild. You can start over. Isabella does not have that luxury. She has a public image to maintain. Do what is right for the family." The cruelty was breathtaking. In their eyes, my life was expendable. My security was collateral damage. I was just a battery they could drain to keep Isabella shining brightly. I looked down at the desk, letting my shoulders slump. I let out a long, defeated sigh, playing the role of the broken, compliant daughter they expected me to be. I made my voice sound hesitant and tired. I told them I only have my emergency savings. If I give this money to you, I have absolutely nothing left to fall back on. Vivian did not even flinch. She said, "Family is your fallback, Chloe. We will always be here for you. Now stop stalling and write the check." I looked back up at Isabella. My expression was a perfect mask of reluctant submission. I told her I cannot just wire $50,000 blindly into an operating account without seeing what is actually going on. If I am going to empty my life savings to cover your payroll, I need to see the ledgers. I need to see Connor's financial books just to see what I can do. Isabella hesitated. She shifted her weight nervously, looking at our parents. She said, "Connor handles all the internal financials. He does not like anyone looking at the raw data. He says it is too complex for outsiders to understand." I kept my voice soft but firm. I said, "If you want my money, Isabella, I need the books. Send me the ledgers Connor prepares for the board. If everything is just a temporary cash flow problem like you claim, then there is nothing to hide. Email me the files right now, and I will head to the bank." Isabella pulled her phone from her designer handbag. Her hands were shaking as she opened her email application. She desperately needed the cash, and she believed I was foolish enough to hand it over. She tapped the screen a few times and hit send. She looked at me and said, "I just forwarded you the internal financial reports. Please, Chloe, go to the bank." I looked at my phone as the notification chimed. The files were secured in my inbox. I had exactly what I needed to cross-reference Connor's lies with my own forensic audit. I looked up at my family, offering them a tired, reassuring nod. The trap was officially set. The moment their luxury SUV disappeared around the corner of my warehouse, I locked the heavy metal doors. I did not waste another second in that building. I got straight into my car and drove back to the penthouse. The entire drive, my phone sat on the passenger seat, glowing with the files Isabella had forwarded. She thought she was handing over a basic profit and loss statement to a naive sister. She had no idea she had just handed a loaded weapon to a billionaire. When the private elevator doors opened to my penthouse, Elias was already waiting in my home office. He had the primary monitors powered on and ready. I tossed my phone onto the sleek glass desk and told him we have the internal ledgers. Let us see exactly what kind of story Connor has been telling his board of directors. Elias connected the device and projected Isabella's files onto the massive screen on the left wall. On the right screen, he pulled up our own forensic audit. The contrast between the two documents was striking. We spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing the numbers line by line. It was a masterclass in corporate fiction. Connor had constructed a labyrinth of financial lies designed to look like aggressive tech growth. If a standard accountant looked at Isabella's ledgers, they would see a startup burning through cash to acquire users. Connor had categorized millions of dollars under vague operational expenses. He listed massive capital drains as research and development scaling, server infrastructure enhancements, and overseas market acquisition. He used every tech buzzword available to justify why my $188 million investment was vanishing into thin air. But Elias and I were not standard accountants. We were private equity sharks, and we knew exactly how to track the blood in the water. "Look at this vendor," Elias said, pointing to a recurring monthly expense on Connor's ledger. Connor claims he is paying $600,000 a month to a data analytics firm called Apex Solutions for user optimization. Elias tapped his keyboard and brought up the forensic breakdown on the right screen. He said, "Apex Solutions does not exist. It is a ghost company registered to a post office box in Delaware. The money hits that account and is immediately converted into cryptocurrency. From there, it is dispersed across a dozen offshore wallets." I leaned back in my leather chair, studying the flow of the stolen capital. It was not just the data analytics firm. There were phantom marketing agencies, non-existent legal retainers, and fabricated software licensing fees. Connor was bleeding AuraSync completely dry. He was taking the venture capital I had provided and funneling it directly into his own pockets. Then Elias pulled up a real estate deed that made my blood run entirely cold. He said I traced the largest chunk of the embezzled funds to a holding company in the Bahamas. 2 months ago, Connor purchased a $6 million beachfront estate. It was paid for entirely in cash, using the exact funds he claimed were going toward expanding the company's server capacity. I stared at the high-resolution photos of the property that Elias had pulled up on the screen. It was a sprawling modern mansion with infinity pools and private beach access. I asked Elias to show me the registration documents for the holding company that purchased the property. Elias zoomed in on the signature line. The holding company was registered solely to Connor. Isabella's name was completely absent from the deed. She had zero legal claim to the property. A dark, sickening realization began to settle in my stomach. I asked Elias to pull up the wire transfer authorization forms from AuraSync, the documents that legally released the money from the company operating accounts to these fake vendors. Elias pulled them up on the main screen. My eyes scanned the bottom of the digital forms. Connor was the chief financial officer. He was the one managing the money, drafting the budgets, and orchestrating the theft. But his signature was not the one authorizing the final transfers. Isabella's signature was on every single fraudulent wire transfer. Connor had effectively insulated himself. He was drafting the paperwork, but he was making Isabella sign off on the massive capital drains in her capacity as chief executive officer. She was so desperate to look like the boss, so eager to play the role of the visionary leader, that she was blindly signing whatever documents her husband put in front of her. She trusted him completely. She thought they were building a legacy together. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the window looking out at the city below. The sheer absolute betrayal of it all was staggering. Connor was not just a greedy, incompetent tech bro. He was a predator. He was actively using the societal dynamics of my family against us. He knew Isabella was obsessed with her image. He knew my parents would constantly praise her and protect her because she represented Black excellence to their country club friends. He weaponized her ambition and her blind trust to build his own personal fortune. I turned back to Elias. My voice was dangerously quiet. I told him Isabella is not just a terrible CEO. She is not just mismanaging the company. Connor is setting her up as the fall guy. Elias nodded, his expression grim. He said if the federal authorities look at these books, they will not see a white chief financial officer embezzling millions. They will see a Black female chief executive officer authorizing millions of dollars in fraudulent wire transfers to shell companies. Connor will claim he was just following her directives. He will take his offshore crypto wallets and disappear to his secret estate in the Bahamas. Isabella will be left holding the bag for massive federal fraud. She will take the entire fall. The reality of the situation locked into place. My parents thought they were protecting generational wealth by indulging Connor and praising Isabella. They thought they were building a legacy. Instead, they had handed their golden child over to a man who was actively building a glass cliff for her to fall from. Connor was preparing to let Isabella go to federal prison so he could walk away rich. My phone buzzed on his desk, breaking the heavy silence in the room. It was an email notification from Isabella. My phone buzzed on the glass desk, shattering the heavy silence of the penthouse. It was an email notification from Isabella indicating she had successfully forwarded the internal ledgers. Barely a second later, the device began vibrating violently with an incoming call. Her name flashed across the bright screen. She was not giving me time to read or analyze. She wanted me acting on pure manufactured panic. I looked across the desk at Elias. I reached out and tapped the speaker button, resting my hands calmly on the edge of the glass. "Did you get them?" Isabella demanded, her voice breathless and tight. "Are you at the credit union yet? Tell me you are pulling the funds, Chloe. The banks close at 5 and we have to process the internal transfers immediately or the system locks us out for the weekend." I kept my voice completely flat, giving away absolutely nothing. "I received the files, Isabella. I am looking at them right now." I paused, letting the seconds stretch out. I looked up at the massive monitors on my wall displaying the damning forensic audit side by side with the fabricated ledgers she had just sent me. I told her I am looking very closely, Isabella, and these numbers do not make any sense. There are massive discrepancies here. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars vanishing every month into vendor accounts that have zero digital footprint. I cannot take out a $50,000 personal loan to plug a hole when your chief financial officer cannot even explain where the primary capital went. A sharp, exasperated groan blasted through the phone speaker. It was the exact sound a parent makes when dealing with a particularly stubborn toddler. "Connor warned me this would happen." Isabella snapped, her tone dripping with intense rehearsed condescension. She was regurgitating his corporate talking points word for word. "He told me you would not understand the complexities of a scaling tech ledger. You are looking at high-level venture capital burn rates through the lens of a retail boutique owner. It is not missing money, Chloe. It is agile infrastructure spending. It is offshore market acquisition. I do not have the time or the patience to give you a finance seminar today. I need the wire transfer confirmation number, and I need it right now." I sat back in my leather chair. My own sister was aggressively defending the very mechanisms her husband was using to frame her for federal fraud. She was so thoroughly brainwashed by his corporate jargon and so desperate to maintain her image as a brilliant tech founder that she was blindly marching toward a prison sentence. And she was demanding I drain my own life savings to pave the way. I leaned forward, bringing my mouth closer to the microphone. My voice dropped to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. "You are not getting a wire transfer, Isabella. I am not destroying my financial security to bail out your company. If you and Connor cannot manage the millions you have already burned through, you do not deserve another dime. The answer is no. The rejection hit her like a physical blow. For a moment there was only dead air on the line. Then the desperate sister act vanished entirely. The facade of the frantic business owner washed away, leaving nothing behind but sheer vicious cruelty. She went straight for the throat, targeting the one event that had been dominating our family group chat for the past 6 months. "You are useless," she spat, her voice vibrating with venom. "You have always been completely useless to this family. You drag us down with your small mindset and your pathetic little life." She took a ragged breath, winding up for the final strike. "Do not even think about showing your face at the Founders in Faith Gala this weekend." The Founders in Faith Gala was the undisputed crown jewel of Atlanta high society. It was the ultimate intersection where elite church leadership met venture capitalism and generational wealth. My mother, Vivian, had been shopping for her dress for half a year. My father, Jerome, had been bragging to every deacon in his congregation. Isabella was scheduled to receive the Businesswoman of the Year award in front of the mayor, prominent politicians, and the biggest investors in the Southeast. It was the absolute pinnacle of my parents' social climbing dreams. I had already purchased a dress. I had already arranged my schedule. Vivian had essentially forced me to buy a ticket, telling me it would be good for me to see what real success looked like. "I know Mom bought you a ticket out of pity," Isabella continued, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "But you are officially disinvited. I am receiving the highest honor in the city on Saturday night. The cameras will be there. The elite will be there. I am cementing our family legacy, and I will not have you there ruining my image. I will not have you standing in the background looking like a struggling local vendor, reminding everyone of the weakest link in our family." She lowered her voice, trying to make the insult cut as deep as possible. "Stay home, Chloe. You do not fit in with our caliber of people anyway. You would just embarrass me." I let her breathe heavily into the phone. I did not interrupt her. I did not defend myself. I just sat in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, looking at the forensic audit on my screen. I looked at the offshore crypto wallets. I looked at the deed to the Bahamas beach house, registered solely in Connor's name. I looked at the undeniable proof that the sister who was currently banishing me from her shining moment was about to be federally indicted for a crime she was too arrogant to see coming. She was throwing me away the second I stopped being financially useful. She was excommunicating me from the family image to protect her own ego. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. "Enjoy your award, Isabella," I said softly. I reached out and pressed the end call button. The line went dead, severing my final tie to the role of the submissive scapegoat daughter. I picked up my burner phone and dropped it directly into the trash can beside my desk. I would never need it again. I turned my chair to face Elias. He was standing perfectly still, his dark eyes watching me intently. He had heard every word. He knew exactly what the gala meant to my parents. He knew exactly how deep that disinvite was intended to cut. The energy in the penthouse shifted instantly from quiet discovery to calculated execution. Elias stepped forward, sliding the heavy manila folder of the forensic audit back into his briefcase. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not offer empty sympathy. He simply waited for the command. I stood up from my desk. The air in the room felt electric. "Get the legal team ready," I told him, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "Call the corporate litigators and contact the federal authorities. We are not just pulling the funding, Elias. We are attending the gala, and we are seizing the assets." The Founders in Faith Gala was the kind of event where Atlanta's old money and new tech money collided under the watchful eyes of the city's most prominent megachurch pastors. Hosted in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis, the room was a sea of crystal chandeliers, towering floral centerpieces, and hundreds of people desperate to prove their net worth. It was a masterclass in performative wealth. This was Isabella's kingdom. From the moment the doors opened, my sister was holding court near the main stage, bathed in the flashing lights of local society photographers. She wore a sequined emerald gown that was loud, aggressive, and clearly designed to pull every single eye in the room. She posed with her hand resting on her hip, tossing her head back in practiced laughter, playing the role of the visionary self-made tech queen to absolute perfection. My parents, Vivian and Jerome, were stationed just a few feet away, practically vibrating with pride. I could picture the exact script they were feeding the church elders and local politicians. They were spinning the tale of the Blackwell family legacy, using Isabella's upcoming Businesswoman of the Year award as ultimate proof of their superior parenting and unyielding faith. They smiled, nodded, and accepted congratulations from the elite, absorbing the social currency they craved like oxygen. Across the room near the premium liquor bar, Connor stood swirling a glass of scotch. He was playing the part of the brilliant stoic co-founder. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket and chatted casually with a group of local angel investors. He looked entirely too relaxed for a man whose offshore crypto wallets and Bahamas beach house were about to be seized by federal authorities. They were all completely intoxicated by their own illusion. Meanwhile, I was stepping out of a bulletproof Maybach at the private VIP entrance. I had not come to the St. Regis to blend in, nor had I come to compete with Isabella's desperate need for attention. I came to foreclose. I bypassed the standard black tie attire and wore a custom-tailored ivory silk crepe gown. It had no visible logos, no sequins, and no desperate cries for validation. It was the kind of quiet, staggering luxury that did not need to shout, because its presence alone commanded absolute silence. The fabric draped flawlessly, trailing just slightly behind me. Around my neck rested a vintage diamond collar, a piece secured from a private auction in Geneva. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, immaculate chignon. I looked exactly like what I was the woman who owned the room. I was not walking in alone. Elias walked to my right, looking like a lethal corporate weapon in his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. His posture was rigid, his eyes scanning the room with the cool calculation of a predator assessing a very weak herd. Flanking my left and rear were Marcus and David, two of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the Southeast. They did not look like party guests. They carried sleek, locking leather briefcases that held the official divestment notices, the forensic audit, and the digital footprint of Connor's entire embezzlement scheme. We moved as a single, impenetrable unit. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom were pulled open by the venue staff. We stepped onto the plush carpet, and the atmospheric shift in the room was instantaneous. Wealth recognizes power. The venture capitalists, the bank executives, the people who actually controlled the money in Atlanta, stopped their conversations. They did not know my face, as I had spent 6 years intentionally avoiding cameras and media coverage, but they recognized the undeniable gravity of my entourage. They recognized Elias, who managed portfolios larger than the gross domestic product of small island nations. They recognized Marcus and David, men whose hourly billing rates made standard millionaires flinch. The sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns naturally parted for us. The low hum of networking and laughter began to quiet down as people turned to stare. The string quartet playing in the corner seemed to fade into the background. I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes shifting from the main stage directly to the grand entrance. We glided through the crowd with absolute precision. I did not search the room for validation. I did not look around nervously like the struggling boutique owner my family assumed I was. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, walking with the posture of a woman who could buy the building and fire the management before the appetizers were even served. I listened to the murmurs rippling through the crowd as we passed. People were whispering, asking each other who the woman in the ivory silk was, asking why the top wealth managers in the city were flanking her like Secret Service agents. I saw a prominent banking executive subtly nudge his colleague, pointing directly at Elias. I saw a state senator physically step aside to clear a broader path for us. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the way my family treated me. At the Sunday dinner table, I was the scapegoat, the financial mule, the disappointment. Here, in the epicenter of the city's financial elite, my sheer presence was parting the room like the Red Sea. Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, past the ice sculptures and the towering champagne pyramids, Isabella was mid-laugh for a society photographer. She had her award acceptance speech memorized. She was ready to accept the applause. Then her eyes shifted. She noticed the photographer lowering his camera to look past her. She saw the crowd parting in a wide, straight aisle. She saw the heavy predatory stride of the two litigators. She saw Elias, a man she recognized vaguely from her board meetings as the proxy for her anonymous angel investor. And finally, her gaze locked onto me. The flawless camera-ready smile melted off her face in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by a look of visceral, unadulterated rage. Her jaw tightened and her eyes widened in shock. She saw the ivory silk, the diamonds, the way the room physically deferred to my presence. But her ego was too massive, her reality too deeply distorted by Connor's lies and our parents enabling to comprehend what was actually happening. She did not see a private equity billionaire arriving to seize her assets. She did not register the danger of the corporate litigators carrying heavy briefcases. She only saw the family scapegoat, the sister she had explicitly forbidden from attending, crashing her crowning moment. In her mind, I was the struggling vendor who had shown up in a rented dress to steal her spotlight. Her face contorted with fury. I watched the golden child completely lose her grip on reality. She shoved past a prominent city councilman without offering an apology, her emerald gown flashing sharply under the chandelier lights. She gripped her small designer clutch like a weapon, marching directly toward the center of the ballroom. Her heels clicked aggressively against the marble borders of the dance floor. She was determined to intercept me, to put me back in my place, and to humiliate me before I could embarrass her in front of her high society audience. I did not stop walking. I kept my pace slow, steady, and inevitable. I looked at Elias and offered a tiny, chilling smile. Let her come. Isabella crossed the polished marble floor of the St. Regis ballroom, with the aggressive, frantic energy of a woman watching her carefully curated reality slip through her fingers. The emerald sequins of her designer gown caught the light of the crystal chandeliers above, flashing sharply as she closed the distance between us. She gripped her small metallic clutch so tightly her knuckles were visibly straining against her dark skin. I stood perfectly still, letting her march directly into the execution zone. Elias remained anchored to my right, while Marcus and David stood tall and immovable behind me, their heavy leather briefcases hanging from their hands like loaded weapons. I told you that you were not welcome here, Isabella hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of panic and rage. She stopped barely 2 feet from me, her chest heaving as she struggled to maintain her camera-ready posture. She looked me up and down, taking in the custom ivory silk crepe gown, the vintage diamond collar, and the sheer, unadulterated power radiating from the men flanking me. Her eyes darted to Elias, trying to place his face, but her massive ego refused to let her connect the dots. In her mind, she was the undisputed queen of the evening, and I was merely an insect that had crawled into her ballroom to steal her spotlight. When whispering did not make me flinch, Isabella made a critical tactical error. She decided to weaponize the crowd. She took a step back and raised her voice, projecting her words so the venture capitalists, the local politicians, and the church elders lingering nearby could hear every single syllable. "Security," she called out, waving her hand toward the entrance. "We have an uninvited guest." The low hum of networking and jazz music instantly dipped. Heads turned in our direction. Atlanta high society lives for scandal, and Isabella was handing it to them on a silver platter. She turned slightly to a prominent tech investor standing a few feet away, forcing a tight plastic smile onto her face. "I am so sorry about this disturbance," she announced loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the nearest tables. "My sister has a terrible habit of showing up where she does not belong. She runs a little online lotion storefront and thinks it entitles her to network with actual executives." She turned her vicious glare back to me, dropping the polite smile entirely. "Are you here for a free meal, Chloe? Did you think you could just crash the Founders and Faith Gala in a rented dress and beg my colleagues for a handout? You are embarrassing yourself. Turn around and walk out of those doors before I have you physically removed from the premises." I did not move. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I just looked at her with a calm, clinical detachment, watching a woman entirely oblivious to the fact that she was standing on a landmine. Before Isabella could escalate her public tantrum further, my parents rushed through the crowd. Vivian and Jerome practically sprinted across the ballroom floor, their faces masks of absolute horror and social terror. My mother was breathless, her elaborate updo slightly out of place from her frantic march. She saw the wealthy elites watching the spectacle, and her priority instantly defaulted to damage control. To her, this was not a family crisis. This was a threat to her country club reputation. Chloe, what is wrong with you? Vivian snapped, keeping her voice to a harsh, furious whisper as she closed in on us. She reached out with a manicured hand, intending to grab my arm and physically drag me toward the exit, just as she had done when I was a disobedient child in church. She never made contact. Elias stepped forward with the smooth, lethal grace of a trained operative. He did not say a word. He simply shifted his body, placing his broad shoulders and bespoke midnight blue tuxedo directly between my mother's outstretched hand and my ivory silk gown. It was a flawless physical barrier. Vivian gasped, stepping back as if she had touched a hot stove, looking deeply offended that a man she deemed a hired bodyguard dared to block her path. Do not touch her. Elias said, his voice low, even, and carrying a subtle threat that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jerome stepped up next to his wife, puffing out his chest and using his booming, authoritative deacon voice. He pointed a thick finger at me. You are embarrassing this family, Chloe. We are sitting at the mayor's table tonight. Isabella is receiving the Businesswoman of the Year award in 20 minutes. You are not going to ruin her moment with your bitter jealousy. Turn around and go back to your warehouse before you do irreparable damage to our legacy. Your legacy? I asked softly, letting the irony wash over the word. Vivian leaned around Elias, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. She hissed, You do not fit in here, Chloe. Look at you trying to parade around with these hired men, pretending you belong in a room with billionaires and visionaries. You are making a fool of yourself. Walk away now and we will pretend this never happened. Right on cue, Connor jogged over to join the firing squad. He held a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand, smelling of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. He slipped his arm around Isabella's waist, playing the part of the protective white savior husband, stepping in to handle the unruly black relative. He looked at me with absolute disgust, completely failing to recognize Marcus and David, the two top-tier corporate litigators, currently holding the exact documents that would send him to federal prison. Is there a problem here? Connor asked, his voice dripping with condescending corporate hostility. He looked me up and down, shaking his head. Chloe, I told you on the phone. You are completely out of your depth. You do not understand how things work at this level. Security is already on their way. Let us not make this a police matter. Walk away before you get hurt. I let the threat hang in the air. I let them exhaust their ammunition. I looked at Isabella's panicked eyes, masking her deep insecurity. I looked at Vivian, sweating under the chandeliers, terrified of the whispering socialites. I looked at Jerome, desperately clinging to a patriarchal authority that held absolutely zero power over me. And I looked at Connor, the arrogant thief, demanding I leave a room I could afford to buy in cash. They were so loud. They were so desperately, frantically loud. They believed that volume and aggression equaled power. They believed that because I remained silent, I was absorbing their abuse. They did not understand that my silence was the silence of a judge watching the guilty write their own confessions. Then the ambient noise in the ballroom shifted again. The heavy, authoritative footsteps of several men approached from my left. The crowd parted respectfully, clearing a wide path. Reginald Sterling, the billionaire real estate mogul who organized the gala and owned half the commercial property in downtown Atlanta, was rushing over. He was a titan in the community, a man whose single endorsement could make or break a company. Isabella spotted him approaching out of the corner of her eye. She immediately sucked in a breath, dropping her furious scowl and pasting on a sycophantic, desperate smile. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown and took a step away from me, positioning herself to intercept him. She was ready to spin the narrative, ready to apologize for her troubled sister and protect her golden image. "Mr. Sterling!" Isabella gushed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I am so incredibly sorry about this minor disturbance. My sister was just leaving. She sometimes struggles with boundaries, but we have the situation completely under control." Reginald Sterling did not slow his pace. He did not offer Isabella a warm smile. He did not acknowledge her apology. He walked right past her, completely ignoring her outstretched hand. He pushed past Jerome, forcing my father to step awkwardly out of the way. He walked directly toward my impenetrable wall of legal and financial power. Elias, Marcus, and David parted seamlessly, creating an opening for the titan of Atlanta real estate. Reginald Sterling stopped directly in front of me. He ignored my screaming sister, my horrified parents, and her arrogant husband. He looked at me and slowly, respectfully bowed his head. Ms. Chloe, it is an absolute honor to finally have the Chief Executive Officer of Crescent Holdings grace one of my events. Reginald Sterling said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant timbre of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed. We have been trying to coax you out of the shadows for years. Thank you for making the exception tonight. The silence that fell over my family was absolute. It was not just quiet. It was the physical manifestation of a paradigm completely shattering. Vivian stood frozen, with her mouth slightly open, the manicured hand that had been reaching for my arm now suspended uselessly in the air. Jerome blinked rapidly, staring at the billionaire real estate mogul as if the man had just started speaking a foreign language. Isabella literally staggered, taking a half step backward. Her brain was violently rejecting the data being presented to it. She looked at Reginald, then at me, then back at Reginald. Mr. Sterling, she stammered, her artificial sweetness cracking into genuine panic. I think you are mistaken. This is my sister Chloe. She runs a tiny retail website out of a warehouse. She is not a chief executive officer. You must be confusing her with someone else. Reginald Sterling slowly turned his head to look at Isabella. The warmth in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, hard stare he used to dismantle incompetent developers in boardrooms. I do not make mistakes regarding who owns the debt on my city blocks, young woman, Reginald said, his tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. Miss Chloe recently acquired the commercial development rights to the entire West Side tech corridor. She manages a private equity firm that dwarfs your little startup by several orders of magnitude. If you do not know who your own sister is, that is a profound personal failure on your part. Do not insult my intelligence by projecting your ignorance onto me. Isabella actually gasped, stepping back as if physically struck. Vivian grabbed Jerome's arm, her knuckles turning white. The church elders and venture capitalists, who had gathered to watch the spectacle, were now murmuring in hushed, shocked tones. The narrative had flipped instantly. Isabella was no longer the tragic victim of a jealous sister. She was a clueless, arrogant amateur who had just been publicly dressed down by the most powerful man in the room for disrespecting a financial titan. I offered Reginald a gracious nod. Thank you, Reginald, I said, keeping my voice perfectly modulated. I prefer to operate quietly, but certain pressing family matters required my direct and public intervention tonight. Reginald smiled knowingly, glancing briefly at Elias. I understand completely. I will leave you to handle your business, Ms. Chloe. My table is yours whenever you are ready. He gave another respectful nod and walked away, leaving absolute devastation in his wake. Before the suffocating silence could break, Connor finally pushed his way through the gathering crowd. He had been lingering near the bar, too absorbed in his own arrogance to notice the tectonic shift that had just occurred. He saw Isabella looking pale and breathless. He saw Vivian and Jerome standing like statues. He saw me still standing perfectly poised in my ivory silk gown. Connor immediately puffed up his chest, adopting his default posture of corporate hostility. He marched directly toward me, aggressively invading my personal space. I thought I told you to leave. Connor snarled, his face flushing red with anger. Are you really so desperate for attention that you have to crash my wife's gala and harass our guests? Security is already coming. You are done here, Chloe. I did not take a single step back. I just looked at him with absolute pity. Connor was so focused on intimidating me that he completely failed to assess the threat perimeter. He was blind to the predators flanking me. He turned his head to motion for a passing hotel staff member, and that was when his eyes swept across my right side. That was when Connor locked eyes with Elias. The physical transformation of Connor was spectacular. It happened in terrifying slow motion. First his hand dropped to his side. Then the aggressive flush of anger drained completely from his face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. His eyes widened to the point of bulging, and his jaw went completely slack. He recognized Elias. For the past 14 months, Elias had sat in the boardroom at Aura Sync. Elias was the stern, uncompromising proxy representative for the anonymous blind trust that provided their $188 million anchor fund. Connor had spent countless hours across conference tables, from Elias sweating through presentations, trying to use financial jargon to justify massive cash burns to this exact man. Connor knew Elias as the gatekeeper to his survival. But Elias was not standing across a boardroom table right now. Elias was standing slightly behind me, positioned in a protective, subservient stance, clearly indicating that he worked directly for my commands. Connor's brain struggled to process the horrific geometry of the situation. If Elias represented the anonymous anchor investor, and Elias answered directly to Chloe, then Chloe was not just the sister-in-law he had spent years mocking. Chloe was the anonymous investor. Chloe owned his company. Chloe owned him. Connor literally stopped breathing. The glass of scotch in his hand trembled violently, sloshing the amber liquid over the rim and onto his expensive velvet tuxedo jacket. He did not even notice the spill. Elias took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the gap. He did not raise his voice, but the lethal authority in his tone cut through the ballroom chatter like a scythe. "Good evening, Connor," Elias said smoothly, offering a razor-thin smile. "You are looking a bit pale. I suppose the stress of an emergency board meeting and a sudden catastrophic loss of operational liquidity will do that to a chief financial officer. Have you found the $50,000 you demanded from my employer earlier today?" Connor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed. The arrogant tech bro who had screamed at me over the phone, calling me a selfish failure, demanding I ruin my credit to save his sinking ship, was currently suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. Isabella, completely oblivious to the silent execution happening in front of her, grabbed Connor's arm. "Connor, tell her to leave," she demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "She is trying to ruin my night. Tell security to drag her out of here." Connor slowly turned his head to look at his wife. He looked at her as if she were a ghost. He could not speak. The crushing reality of his situation had finally trapped him. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew about the offshore crypto wallets. He knew about the $6 million beachfront estate in the Bahamas. He knew about the fabricated software licensing fees and the dummy corporations. He also knew that the person he had been stealing from for 14 months was standing right in front of him, flanked by the two most aggressive corporate litigators in the state of Georgia. I stepped forward, breaking the frozen tableau. I looked directly into Connor's terrified eyes. "I told you on the phone, Connor," I said, my voice soft, melodic, and dripping with absolute venom. "I told you that you do not get to dictate terms to me. I told you that I am not destroying my financial security to bail out your company. You told me I was out of my depth. You told me I did not understand high-level business dynamics. You said I did not fit in with your caliber of people." I gestured gracefully toward Elias, Marcus, and David. "I think my caliber of people is exactly why you are hyperventilating right now, Connor." Vivian and Jerome were frantically trying to piece the conversation together. My mother stepped forward, her hands fluttering nervously. "Chloe, what is going on here?" she pleaded, dropping the aggressive tone entirely and replacing it with confused desperation. "What does Elias have to do with Aurasync? Why is Mr. Sterling calling you a chief executive officer?" I kept my eyes locked on Connor, letting him suffer for just a few moments longer. He was physically shaking now, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had shattered every bone in his corporate body. He was trapped in a room full of Atlanta elite, unable to run, unable to scream, unable to defend himself. Isabella shook Connor's arm violently. "Why are you just standing there?" she yelled, her composure completely destroyed. "Do something! She is lying. She runs a lotion store. Tell them she is lying." Connor finally found his voice. It was a weak, pathetic croak. "Isabella, shut up." He rasped, his eyes never leaving mine. "Just shut up." Isabella gasped, stepping back from her husband as if he had struck her. She looked wildly from Connor to Elias to me. The invincible power couple was imploding in the center of the St. Regis ballroom, and they were doing it under the blinding lights of the society photographers they had invited. I looked at my parents, taking in their absolute bewilderment. They had built their entire social identity on the lie that Isabella was the ultimate success story. They had spent decades punishing me for not fitting into their rigid, superficial mold. They had allowed Connor to disrespect me because his skin color and his job title gave him unearned authority in their eyes. They had worshipped an illusion, and now the illusion was burning to the ground. It was time to pour gasoline on the fire. I turned my attention squarely back to Isabella, who was currently watching her husband unravel with mounting terror. I reached my hand out to the left. David, the senior corporate litigator, instantly unclasped his leather briefcase and placed a thick stack of legal documents directly into my palm. The heavy, high-grade paper felt perfect in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of my ultimate vindication. I looked at the golden child. I looked at the sister who had told me to stay home because I was too embarrassing to be seen. I smiled a genuine, warm, and terrifying smile. "I am not crashing your gala, Isabella," I said, letting the absolute certainty of my power ring out clearly, "and I am definitely not here for a free meal." I held the thick stack of premium legal paper in my hands. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of my ivory silk gown as I stepped closer to my sister. Isabella looked down at the documents and then back up at my face. Her eyes were wide and frantic, searching for a punchline, searching for a way out of the corner she had painted herself into. I did not give her one. I extended my arm and pressed the heavy stack of divestment papers directly against her chest, forcing her to take them or let them fall to the marble floor. She reflexively wrapped her hands around the folder, her manicured fingers trembling violently against the embossed seal of Crescent Holdings. I told her, "I am not crashing your event, Isabella. I am foreclosing on your entire life." I looked deeply into her panicked eyes, making sure she heard every single syllable. I told her, "I am the anonymous angel investor you have been bragging about to the press for the last 2 years. I am the sole owner of the blind trust that kept your doors open. That little online lotion thing you have been mocking all night bought your entire board of directors." The physical reaction was immediate and devastating. Isabella's jaw trembled uncontrollably. The designer metallic clutch slipped from her fingers, hitting the polished floor with a sharp crack that echoed across the silent ballroom. She looked down at the front page of the legal documents. Her eyes scanned the bold black text, reading the name Crescent Holdings right next to her own company name. She saw the formal withdrawal authorization. She saw my signature boldly printed at the bottom of the page right above my title as Chief Executive Officer. Her golden child ego, the impenetrable armor she had worn since childhood, shattered into a million irreparable pieces in real time. The sister she had mocked, the sister she had explicitly disinvited, the sister she had used as a baseline for her own superiority, was the only reason she had ever achieved anything at all. I had literally bankrolled the very arrogance she was currently choking on. The reality was crushing her physical posture. Everything she believed about her own brilliance, her own self-made success, was a carefully constructed lie, funded entirely by the woman she viewed as a failure. Vivian let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Jerome took a heavy step backward, bumping into a cocktail table and sending a champagne flute crashing to the floor. My parents had spent their entire lives grooming Isabella to be the pinnacle of our family legacy. They had enabled her cruelty because they believed her success validated their parenting to their church congregation and their country club friends. They had worshipped at the altar of her Stanford degree and her magazine covers. Now they were watching their supreme achievement unravel in front of the entire Atlanta elite. They were realizing that the actual billionaire, the true standard of black excellence they so desperately wanted to claim, was the daughter they had treated like a peasant. Jerome opened his mouth to speak, to demand some kind of explanation, but David simply shifted his stance. The senior corporate litigator offered my father a cold warning glare that instantly silenced whatever authoritarian demand Jerome was about to make. My father shrank back, completely powerless in the face of actual authority. Isabella shook her head rapidly, a desperate, frantic motion to deny the facts written on the paper in her hands. She stammered out that it was impossible. She said the investor was a private equity firm from New York. She said Elias was just a proxy for a corporate board full of older white men. She was desperately trying to reject the truth because accepting it meant accepting that she was a complete fraud. She pointed a shaking finger at me and told the whispering crowd that I was lying, that I had fabricated the documents to ruin her night out of pure jealousy. I kept my voice smooth and merciless, cutting through her hysteria with absolute authority. I told her Elias works for me. He has worked for me since I sold my skincare company for 9 figures 6 years ago. I hid behind a blind trust because I knew you and Connor were too fragile to accept capital from a black woman you viewed as inferior. I knew your ego could not handle the fact that I scaled a business into a global acquisition while you were still playing with venture capital pitch decks. I took a step closer, narrowing the distance between us. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her actions. I told her I wanted to see you win, Isabella. I wanted to see my sister succeed in a brutal tech industry. But you could not just be successful. You had to be cruel. You had to use my money to fund your ego and then use your ego to try and destroy my dignity. You demanded I ruin my credit to pay your staff while you paraded around in an emerald gown bought with my capital. I gestured gracefully to the ballroom around us, encompassing the crystal chandeliers, the ice sculptures, and the staring faces of the politicians and banking executives. I told her this entire gala, your designer dress, your magazine covers, they were all paid for by the struggling boutique owner. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, the charity has officially ended. The absolute finality of my words hung in the air. Isabella looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to lean heavily against a high-top table to keep from collapsing in front of the local elites she so desperately wanted to impress. She clutched the divestment documents to her chest as if holding them tighter might change the reality printed on the pages. She was completely broken, stripped of her fake empire, and exposed to the very people she sought to rule. But Connor was not done. The initial shock of seeing Elias had paralyzed him, but the survival instincts of a cornered predator finally kicked in. He realized that if Aura Sync went down, his entire offshore embezzlement scheme would be exposed to the federal government. The fake data analytics vendors, the Bahamas beach house, the crypto wallets, everything would be subjected to a grueling federal audit. He needed to invalidate my authority immediately. He needed to reassert control in front of the witnesses and somehow regain the upper hand before the venture capitalists in the room called their own lawyers. Connor pushed past Isabella, forcibly inserting himself between us. He puffed out his chest, standing at his full height, to try and use his physical size to intimidate me. The sickly pale color had left his face, replaced by an angry, aggressive red flush. He smoothed his velvet tuxedo jacket, trying to project the image of a seasoned corporate executive handling an unruly subordinate. He pointed a finger directly at my face and unleashed a barrage of rapid-fire corporate hostility. He raised his voice, ensuring the surrounding guests could hear him clearly. He told me, "This is a pathetic stunt, Chloe. You cannot just waltz into a gala and claim to dissolve a 9-figure partnership based on a personal vendetta. That is not how venture capital operates in the real world. We have legally binding operational covenants. We have staggered withdrawal lockup periods and strict term sheets to prevent exactly this kind of emotional interference from uneducated investors." Connor took another step forward, his tone dripping with the condescending arrogance of a man who believed his corporate jargon made him untouchable. He said, "You are violating basic fiduciary duties, and I will have our legal team tie you up in litigation for the next decade. You have absolutely no legal standing to pull that capital without a minimum 12-month runway. You are nothing but a silent partner who vastly overstepped her boundaries, and I am going to make you pay for it." Connor finished his aggressive rant breathing heavily, his chest puffed out in his expensive velvet tuxedo. He looked around the ballroom, desperately hoping the venture capitalists and banking executives were nodding in agreement with his corporate word salad. They were not. They were looking at me, waiting for the execution. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply extended my left hand. Marcus, the senior litigator standing over my shoulder, stepped forward and placed a second, significantly thicker manila folder into my palm. I looked at Connor with absolute freezing calm. I told him that operational covenants and withdrawal lockups only apply to legitimate business partnerships. They do not apply to active crime scenes. Connor blinked, his arrogant sneer faltering for a fraction of a second. The sweat broke out across his forehead, gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to look down at the heavy folder in my hands. I told him, this is not a term sheet dispute, Connor. This is a comprehensive forensic financial audit conducted by Crescent Holdings' Internal Investigations Unit. And it details exactly how you embezzled over $4 million of my money. The word embezzled echoed across the silent ballroom like a gunshot. The venture capitalists in the room, who had been watching with predatory silence, suddenly took a collective step back, recognizing the toxic smell of federal crime. Connor's face instantly lost all of its angry red flush, turning a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth, but his extensive corporate vocabulary completely failed him. I opened the folder and held the first page up so he could see the intricate flowchart mapping his theft. I read the details aloud, ensuring my voice carried to the surrounding crowd. I told him we traced the phantom marketing agencies. We found Apex Solutions, your fake data analytics firm, registered to a post office box in Delaware. We tracked the venture capital as it left Orasync operating accounts, converted into cryptocurrency, and vanished into a dozen offshore wallets. I turned the page, revealing a high-resolution photograph of a sprawling modern mansion. I tapped my manicured finger against the image. I asked him how the weather was in the Bahamas. I asked him if he enjoyed the $6 million beachfront estate he purchased entirely in cash, using a holding company registered solely in his name. Isabella let out a sharp, choked gasp. She stared at the photograph of the mansion, her eyes wide with total incomprehension. She looked at Connor, her voice trembling as she asked him what I was talking about. She asked him to explain the beach house. Connor ignored his wife. He was staring at the forensic audit as if it were a venomous snake about to strike his throat. His entire body began to tremble. The glass of scotch he was holding slipped from his lifeless fingers, shattering loudly against the marble floor and splashing amber liquid across his polished leather shoes. I did not give him a second to breathe. I handed the thick folder directly to him, pressing it against his chest just as I had done with Isabella's divestment papers. I told him, you thought you were the smartest person in the room. You thought you could use high-level corporate jargon to blind a black woman who trusted you while simultaneously draining the anonymous billionaire investor you thought was some oblivious old white man. You completely underestimated who you were dealing with on both fronts. Connor clutched the folder, his hands shaking so violently the papers audibly rustled. He stammered out a weak, pathetic denial. He said there was a mistake, that the funds were allocated for future infrastructure, that I was misinterpreting aggressive tax strategies. I cut him off completely. I told him, there is no misinterpretation, Connor. You set up your own wife to take the fall for federal fraud. You drafted the fraudulent wire transfers, but you made Isabella sign every single one of them as chief executive officer. You insulated yourself, planning to let her go to federal prison while you skipped town to your offshore estate. The crowd audibly gasped. The Atlanta elite, the church elders, the politicians, they were all witnessing the absolute destruction of the city's golden tech couple. I took a step back and looked at Elias. Elias reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a slim, official-looking document. He handed it to Connor. I told Connor that document is a copy of the formal dossier we handed over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation at noon today. We did not just freeze your accounts, we froze your passports. The federal authorities are already reviewing the wire fraud, the money laundering, and the gross violation of fiduciary duties. The realization that the FBI was already involved completely broke him. The arrogant, condescending white savior who had screamed at me over the phone demanding I ruin my credit to save his company instantly evaporated. What replaced him was a terrified, spineless coward, desperate to save his own skin. Connor physically crumbled. He dropped to his knees right there on the ballroom floor, the forensic audit spilling out around him. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning any pretense of pride or dignity. He begged me. He said, "Chloe, please, you have to understand. I was under so much pressure. The company was bleeding cash before I even got there. I was just trying to secure a nest egg. I can give the money back. I can transfer the deed to the house right now. Please do not let them send me to prison." When begging me did not work, Connor did exactly what I knew he would do. He turned on his wife with breathtaking speed. He scrambled to his feet, pointing a shaking finger directly at Isabella. He shouted that she knew about it. She signed the authorization forms. He screamed, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "She is the CEO. She holds the fiduciary duty, not me. I was just a consultant following her aggressive expansion directives. She wanted the beach house to entertain investors. She demanded magazine covers and luxury gala sponsorships." He told the staring crowd that he was just following the orders of a narcissistic founder, throwing the woman he swore to love and protect directly under the speeding bus of federal prosecution. Isabella's knees finally gave out. She sank to the marble floor, her emerald designer gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She stared at the man she had loved, the man she had allowed to disrespect her own sister, as he loudly and frantically offered to testify against her in federal court. The white husband she had paraded as a trophy and a business genius was actively handing her over to the federal government to save himself. She covered her face with her hands and let out a guttural, heartbroken sob, completely shattering in front of the entire Atlanta high society. I watched the golden couple implode with cold, clinical satisfaction. I had not destroyed them. I had simply held up a mirror and let them destroy each other. But the sickening spectacle was not over. While Connor was weeping and Isabella was sobbing into her hands, I noticed movement from the periphery of my vision. My parents, Vivian and Jerome, had been standing paralyzed in shock, watching their entire social identity burn to the ground. They had spent decades treating me like dirt, elevating Isabella as the standard of Black excellence and praising Connor as the brilliant addition to their legacy. Now, staring at the wreckage, their survival instincts kicked in. They looked at Isabella, a disgraced bankrupt woman, about to face federal fraud charges. Then they looked at me. They saw the custom ivory silk gown, the vintage diamonds, the billionaire real estate mogul, treating me with deep reverence, and the team of ruthless lawyers at my command. The mathematics of their parental love shifted in a fraction of a second. Vivian smoothed her cream-colored pantsuit, forcibly wiping the look of horror from her face. She pasted on a desperate, wide, and entirely fabricated smile. Jerome adjusted his tie, puffing out his chest as he tried to reclaim his patriarchal authority, completely abandoning his golden child, who was currently weeping on the floor. They literally stepped over the scattered pages of Connor's forensic audit and moved directly toward me. They were preparing to make the most sickening gaslighting pivot of their entire lives, fully intending to erase 35 years of emotional abuse in order to claim the billionaire daughter they had just discovered. Vivian and Jerome approached me with a level of manufactured warmth that made my stomach turn. They walked right past Isabella. Their golden child was curled on the marble floor, weeping into her own hands, but they did not even glance down at her. Her utility to them had officially expired. She was a massive social liability now. I was the new asset. My mother stopped inches from me. The familiar scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over me, but it could not mask the stench of her sheer desperation. "Chloe, baby," Vivian cooed. Her voice was dripping with a sickly sweet affection I had not heard directed at me since I was a toddler. She reached out with both hands, attempting to grasp my arms in a show of deep maternal connection. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I just looked at her hands hovering in the air until she awkwardly pulled them away. Jerome cleared his throat, adopting a tone of deep paternal pride. He adjusted his suit jacket and spoke loudly, making sure the lingering venture capitalists and church elders could hear him. "We knew it," he declared. "We always knew you had a brilliant mind, Chloe. All those years we pushed you, all those times we were hard on you. It was because we saw this staggering potential. We knew you were destined to build an empire. You possess the true Blackwell resilience." The audacity was breathtaking. 10 minutes ago, I was an embarrassment who needed to be escorted out by security. Less than an hour ago, they had threatened to cut me off entirely if I did not drain my modest savings to fund Connor's theft. Now I was the manifestation of their superior parenting. They were actively trying to gaslight me in front of hundreds of people, attempting to rebrand decades of emotional abuse and financial manipulation as tough love. Vivian leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She looked at the scattered forensic audit papers on the floor, then up at my face. "You have proven your point, sweetheart," she said, her eyes wide with desperate negotiation. "You showed everyone how powerful you are. You showed Connor his place. Now let us handle this quietly. Let us keep this in the family." I tilted my head, studying the sheer delusion operating behind my mother's eyes. I asked her exactly what she meant by keeping it in the family. Jerome stepped closer, dropping his booming voice to match Vivian's frantic urgency. "You have the capital, Chloe. You have the leverage. You can absorb this loss. Pay off whatever debt Connor created and restructure the board. Let Isabella keep her title as Chief Executive Officer. We can draft a strict non-disclosure agreement for Connor and quietly divorce him out of the family. But we cannot let the church elders or the media see Isabella go down for federal fraud. The scandal will ruin our reputation." Vivian nodded vigorously, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light. "You are a strong black woman, Chloe. You have the resources to fix this. Isabella is fragile right now. She cannot handle a federal investigation and a public divorce. You are the backbone of this family. Protect your sister. Protect our name." There it was, the ultimate trap, the toxic expectation that had suffocated me my entire life. They did not care about my success. They did not care about the long nights I spent building a 9-figure company from scratch. They only cared about my utility. They wanted me to deploy my hard-earned billionaire status, to act as a human shield for their fragile egos. They wanted me to step back into the shadows, open my checkbook, and quietly finance the continuation of Isabella's fake legacy. They expected me to pay millions of dollars to clean up the criminal mess of a mediocre white man, just to save my black family the embarrassment of admitting they had backed the wrong horse. The community expects black women to be the mules of the world, carrying the weight of everyone else's failures, and I was looking right at the architects of my burden. I looked down at Isabella. She had stopped sobbing and was looking up at me, her tear-streaked face full of pathetic, fragile hope. She actually believed I would do it. She believed the indoctrination was so deep that I would sacrifice my own empire to save hers. I lifted my gaze back to my parents. The coldness inside me solidified into pure, unbreakable titanium. I did not raise my voice, but every word I spoke was a precise surgical strike aimed directly at the foundation of their toxic dynamic. I told them, I am not your mule. I am not the emotional sponge for this family's dysfunction, and I am certainly not the financial cleanup crew for a failing tech startup. Vivian's fake smile completely collapsed. Her mouth fell open in shock. I took a step forward, forcing both of my parents to physically retreat. I told Vivian that tough love does not look like public humiliation. I told Jerome that the true Blackwell resilience he was so proud of was built in spite of him, not because of him. I reminded them that just an hour ago, they told me I did not fit in with their caliber of people. "You are absolutely right," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "I do not fit in with you. I do not build fake companies. I do not marry thieves to secure a magazine cover. And I do not sacrifice my peace to protect a lie." Jerome's face hardened, his authoritarian rage flaring up one last time as his control slipped away forever. "You are destroying your own blood, Chloe. Family protects each other." I looked at him with absolute ice. I stared directly into the eyes of the man who had allowed me to be belittled, mocked, and financially drained for decades. "Family protects each other." I repeated, my tone devoid of any mercy. "You just protected an illusion. I am liquidating the company." Isabella let out a sharp, devastated wail, burying her face back into her hands. The finality of the word liquidating echoed through the space around us. It meant there was no restructuring, there was no bailout, there was no saving face. Aura Sync was dead, and the financial wreckage was going to be televised across every tech blog and news station in the country. Vivian grabbed her chest, taking a dramatic, shaky breath as if she might faint. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, realizing that her social currency had just plummeted to absolute zero. She could no longer brag about her tech mogul daughter, and she could never claim the billionaire daughter who had just publicly executed her reputation. Connor, who was still kneeling on the floor amid the scattered audit papers, let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He had been hoping my parents would successfully manipulate me into a quiet settlement. He had been praying for the strong black woman trope to save his skin and keep his offshore accounts intact. Now he knew he was completely out of options. He scrambled to gather the scattered pages of the audit, his hands shaking wildly. He looked frantically toward the ballroom exits, calculating his chances of slipping out through the kitchen corridors before my lawyers could physically detain him. He thought he still had a window of time to reach his car and get to the airport. He was entirely wrong. Elias stepped up to my side. He did not look at my parents or my sister. He kept his gaze locked on the main entrance of the grand ballroom. He smoothly adjusted his bespoke cuffs and spoke softly. "They are here." The heavy brass doors of the St. Regis ballroom swung open with a resounding thud that cut through the remaining ambient noise in the room. The crowd of wealthy socialites, venture capitalists, and politicians parted rapidly, pressing themselves against the walls and cocktail tables to clear a massive path. Walking through the entrance was not the venue security team. It was a highly coordinated tactical unit. Half a dozen uniformed Atlanta Police Department officers strode into the ballroom, flanking 4 agents in dark windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Elias had not just sent a digital dossier to the federal authorities. He had coordinated the timeline of the divestment drop with a federal task force investigating white-collar crime. They had been waiting in the staging area of the hotel lobby until Elias gave the signal that the confrontation was secure and the targets were stationary. The lead FBI agent, a tall, imposing woman with a clipboard and a stern, uncompromising expression, walked directly toward our location. The ballroom was dead silent, except for the heavy rhythmic sound of law enforcement boots stepping against the marble floor. Connor froze. The papers he had managed to gather slipped from his hands, fluttering back down to the ground. His eyes darted wildly, tracking the approaching federal agents. He let out a strange, high-pitched sound of pure animal terror. Vivian and Jerome instinctively backed away from Connor, putting as much physical distance as possible between themselves and the impending arrest. They wanted absolutely no part of the public shame about to unfold. They left their son-in-law isolated in the center of the room. The lead agent stopped directly in front of our group. She barely glanced at me or my parents. She looked down at the pathetic, sweating man kneeling on the floor in a ruined velvet tuxedo. "Connor Hayes!" she said, her voice projecting loud and clear across the silent ballroom. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and violation of federal securities laws." 2 uniformed officers stepped forward, grabbing Connor by the arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. He did not resist. He was completely limp, a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant executive who had tried to intimidate me earlier that day. As the officers pulled his arms behind his back and the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room, I watched the last remaining pillar of Isabella's fake empire crumble into dust. The trap had fully snapped shut, and I held the only key. The collapse of Aura Sync did not take weeks or months. It took exactly 4 days. When you sever the main artery of a company built entirely on hype and stolen funds, the death rattle is incredibly fast. By Monday morning, the financial press had gotten hold of the story. The headlines were ruthless. The golden couple of Atlanta tech was dragged through the mud on every major business blog and local news station. Connor never even made it back to his leased corporate office. The federal agents held him without bail. Our forensic audit was so surgical, so utterly comprehensive, that the federal prosecutors did not even need to offer him a plea deal. He sat in a holding cell wearing a standard issue uniform, completely stripped of his velvet tuxedo and his unearned corporate arrogance. His offshore crypto wallets were seized. The $6 million beach house in the Bahamas was locked down by international authorities. All of his high-level business dynamics and aggressive scaling strategies translated to one simple charge in federal court: wire fraud. He was looking at 20 years minimum. Isabella experienced a different kind of execution. She avoided a federal indictment, but the cost to her ego was far more devastating than a prison sentence. To avoid being charged as Connor's co-conspirator, her legal team had to prove that she was completely oblivious to the daily operations of her own company. They had to stand up in front of a judge and argue that Isabella was too incompetent, too utterly clueless about basic finance, to have orchestrated the embezzlement. She had to publicly admit that she was merely a figurehead, a puppet who blindly signed wire transfers so she could play dress-up and pose for magazine covers. The humiliation broke her. The board of directors formally dissolved the company. Her corporate accounts were frozen, and her personal assets were seized to pay off the massive mountain of debt Connor had left in his wake. Her luxury cars were repossessed in broad daylight. Her credit cards were declined at the grocery store. The woman who had told me I did not fit in with her caliber of people was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy before the end of the month. She had nothing left. No company, no husband, no money, and no pedestal to stand on. But the most spectacular downfall belonged to my parents. Vivian and Jerome had tied their entire social existence to Isabella's success. They had used her fabricated wealth to secure their position among the elite of Atlanta. They had bragged at every Sunday service, every auxiliary board meeting, and every country club luncheon about their brilliant Stanford-educated daughter. When the news of the embezzlement broke, the blowback from their community was immediate and merciless. African American high society operates on a strict code of reputation, and my parents had just become the biggest liability in the city. The same church elders who had toasted to their success now offered them condescending prayers of pity. The women in Vivian's social circles perfected the art of the Southern freeze-out. They would smile tightly, offer a sympathetic bless your heart, and then promptly uninvite my mother from every charity gala and garden party on the calendar. My father was quietly asked to step down from his position as a senior deacon. The church leadership determined that his failure to manage his own household disqualified him from guiding the congregation. Jerome, the man who loved to project absolute patriarchal authority, was stripped of his title and relegated to the back pews. They were social pariahs. They had sacrificed their actual billionaire daughter to protect an illusion, and now the illusion had evaporated, leaving them with nothing but the ash. They could not even brag about my success to save face, because they knew absolutely nothing about my life. They did not know the name of my holding company. They did not know my address. They had spent 35 years ignoring my reality, and now they had no way to claim my victory as their own. For 2 weeks, I watched the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. I did not give interviews. I did not gloat on social media. I simply went back to work managing my empire with Elias and the rest of my team. I drank my morning espresso. I reviewed my global portfolios. I slept soundly for 8 hours every single night. The chaotic noise of my family had been entirely muted. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the profound silence of my home was interrupted. I was sitting in my home office reviewing a new acquisition target when the secure intercom on my desk chimed softly. It was the head of security from my residential building. The concierge rarely contacted me directly unless a strict protocol was being breached. I tapped the glowing button on the console. The security chief kept his voice highly professional, but I could hear the underlying tension. He informed me that there was a situation in the main lobby. 2 individuals claiming to be my parents were currently demanding access to the private elevator. I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. I asked the security chief to describe their demeanor. He told me they were highly agitated. They had tried to bypass the front desk and follow a resident through the secure partition. When security intercepted them, they began shouting about family emergencies and demanding to see the chief executive officer of Crescent Holdings. They had apparently spent the last 2 weeks hiring private investigators to track down my actual address because they had no other way to find me. They were desperate. The social freeze-out had suffocated them. The reality of Isabella's bankruptcy and the mounting legal fees had drained whatever modest savings they actually possessed. They had nowhere else to turn. The golden child was broken, the white savior husband was in jail, and the church community had turned its back. I looked at the high-definition security feed on my secondary monitor. The camera displayed the immaculate marble lobby of my building. Vivian and Jerome were standing near the reception desk. They looked exhausted. My mother's posture was slumped, her hair lacking its usual perfect volume. My father looked panicked, pacing back and forth with his phone in his hand. They looked like two people who had just realized they were standing at the bottom of a very deep, very dark hole. I pressed the intercom button again. I told the security chief to hold them in the lobby. I told him I would be coming down to handle the situation personally. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the lines of my tailored suit. They wanted to see the daughter they had discarded. They wanted to leverage the family bond they had abused for decades. I walked toward the private elevator, ready to give them exactly what they had earned. Absolute permanent silence. The private elevator descended silently toward the main lobby of the building. I watched the floor indicators light up one by one, feeling a profound sense of finality. This was the last time I would ever have to deal with the people who brought me into this world only to treat me like a footstool. The polished steel doors glided open, revealing the expansive marble lobby. My security chief, Marcus, stood at attention near the front desk. Behind a discreet velvet rope, my parents paced like caged animals. They looked entirely out of their element. Vivian was clutching a designer handbag that was now virtually worthless to her. Jerome was sweating through his collar. The moment the elevator doors opened, they both froze. They locked eyes on me, and the sheer desperation radiating from them was palpable. "Chloe," Vivian cried out, her voice cracking as she tried to push past the security desk. "Chloe, please, you have to talk to us." Marcus stepped seamlessly into her path, raising a hand to stop her forward momentum. I gave him a subtle nod, signaling that I had the situation under control. I walked slowly across the lobby, my heels clicking against the pristine marble. I did not rush. I took my time, forcing them to wait for my arrival. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from them, maintaining a safe physical and emotional distance. I asked them what they wanted, making my voice as cold and hollow as an empty vault. Jerome spoke first, trying to summon the booming patriarchal voice that used to terrify me as a child. He said, "We are your parents, Chloe. We had to hire private investigators just to find out where you live. You cannot just cut us off like this. Your sister is facing utter ruin. The bankruptcy court is liquidating her remaining assets today. We need your help to retain a top-tier defense attorney for her civil cases." Vivian reached out over the velvet rope, her eyes brimming with frantic tears. She said, "They took everything, Chloe. The church elders will not even return our phone calls. My friends at the country club pretend they do not see me at the grocery store. We are a laughingstock. You have the money. We know you have the money. You can pay Isabella's legal fees. You can quietly settle this and restore our family name. Please, baby. You are the only one who can save us." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me. They were not apologizing for decades of emotional abuse. They were not apologizing for allowing Connor to insult me. They were not even apologizing for the fact that Isabella had explicitly disinvited me from her gala. They were only apologizing because the ATM had closed and they needed the cash. I kept my posture rigid. I did not cross my arms or show any defensive body language. I simply stood there, completely immune to their performance. I told them that I found it fascinating how quickly they remembered my name when the golden child ran out of funds. I reminded them that just a few days ago they were standing in a ballroom telling me I did not fit in with their caliber of people. I reminded Vivian that she had called me a struggling vendor who needed to learn sacrifice. I reminded Jerome that he had ordered me to leave the gala so I would not ruin his legacy. "You built your legacy on a foundation of sand," I told them, my voice echoing clearly through the massive lobby. "You worshipped a mediocre white man who robbed you blind because he wore a nice suit and used big corporate words. You elevated Isabella because she gave you the superficial status you craved. You looked at me and saw nothing but a workhorse. You wanted me to be the mule for this family's ego. But true strength is knowing when to drop the dead weight. Vivian gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. She said, "How can you be so cruel? We are your blood. We raised you. We sacrificed for you." "You did not sacrifice for me," I corrected her sharply. "You sacrificed me. There is a massive difference. You fed me to the wolves every single time it benefited your social standing. You watched Isabella demean me, and you applauded her for it. You allowed Connor to treat me like garbage because you were too cowardly to challenge the man holding the purse strings. Well, now I am the woman holding the purse strings, and my purse is permanently closed to you." Jerome's face turned a deep mottled red. His desperation morphed back into anger. He pointed a finger at me and demanded I stop disrespecting them. He said, "You have a duty to this family, Chloe. You cannot just walk away from your own flesh and blood when we are in a crisis. You have millions of dollars sitting in a bank account while your sister is being destroyed." I did not flinch. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a thick, sealed envelope stamped with the official insignia of Crescent Holdings' legal department. I held it out. Jerome looked at the envelope confused. He hesitantly reached out and took it from my hand. He asked what it was. I told him it is a legally binding cease and desist order. The color drained from his face entirely. Vivian let out a small, horrified whimper. I explained the terms to them with absolute surgical precision. I told them that the document prohibits them from contacting me via phone, email, or third-party intermediaries. It prohibits them from coming within 500 feet of my residence, my corporate offices, or any property owned by my holding company. It strictly forbids them from speaking to the media or anyone else regarding my personal life or my financial assets. "If you violate any term of that order," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, "my legal team will file immediate harassment and stalking charges. We will bury you in litigation so deep you will never see the light of day. I will freeze your remaining bank accounts, and I will let Marcus and David dismantle whatever is left of your miserable lives. You have absolutely no access to me anymore. This is total, absolute no contact." Vivian began to sob loudly, gripping the velvet rope. She cried out my name, begging me not to do this, telling me she loved me and that I was making a terrible mistake. She said family was forever. I looked at her one last time. I felt no anger, no sadness, no regret. The emotional cord that tied me to them had been cleanly severed. I told her family protects each other, Vivian. You just protected an illusion. Enjoy the reality. I did not wait for her response. I did not watch Jerome open the envelope. I simply turned my back on them. I walked smoothly and confidently across the marble lobby, the sound of my heels masking the sound of Vivian's weeping. Marcus stepped aside, allowing me to pass. I walked straight into the private elevator. I pressed the button for the penthouse. The polished steel doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of my parents completely. I closed my eyes and took a deep, clean breath. The toxicity was finally gone. The polished steel doors of the private elevator slid completely shut, sealing away the sound of my mother's desperate weeping and my father's furious demands. I stood alone in the quiet cabin as it ascended smoothly toward the 65th floor. With every number that lit up on the digital display, I felt another heavy, rusted chain snap and fall away from my shoulders. For 35 years, I had dragged the weight of their expectations, their disappointments, and their insatiable egos. Now I was traveling upward, entirely weightless. The elevator chimed a soft, pleasant note. The doors parted not to my residential penthouse, but to the executive boardroom of Crescent Holdings, which occupied the entire floor below my home. This was the nerve center of my actual reality. The walls were paneled in rich, dark mahogany, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a fierce golden light across the city, illuminating the very commercial blocks that my firm owned and operated. I stepped into the room, The atmosphere was a profound contrast to the chaotic, performative desperation of the lobby I had just left. Here there was no posturing, there was no shouting, there was only the quiet, lethal hum of absolute competence. Gathered around the massive, live-edge walnut table was my real team. Elias was seated at the head reviewing a digital portfolio. To his right sat the senior corporate litigators who had surgically dismantled my brother-in-law's offshore empire. Across from them sat Camille, my chief strategy officer, a brilliant, razor-sharp African-American woman who possessed more business acumen in her little finger than Isabella and Connor combined. They were not my blood, but they were my true family. They were a carefully selected circle of professionals who valued my mind, respected my vision, and guarded my empire with their lives. When I walked into the room, the conversation naturally paused. They did not scramble or perform. They simply looked up and offered a collective nod of deep, unspoken respect. They knew exactly what I had just handled downstairs. They knew the emotional toll of excising toxic family members, but they also knew I did not need pity or coddling. I needed exactly what they provided, which was loyalty and execution. Elias slid a leather-bound dossier across the smooth surface of the table. He looked at me, his dark eyes steady and calm. He told me the West Side Tech Corridor acquisition had just cleared the final regulatory hurdles. The commercial deeds were officially registered to Crescent Holdings. We had successfully secured 80% of the premium development space in the district. It was a multi-billion-dollar urban development project negotiated quietly, funded completely in cash, and executed flawlessly. I walked over to the table and rested my hand on the dossier. I thought about Isabella scrambling to cover a $50,000 payroll. I thought about my father bragging to his church deacons about a fabricated tech legacy. They had spent their entire lives desperately trying to look wealthy, while I spent my life actually building wealth. They played pretend entrepreneur while I quietly bought the very ground they walked on. I took my seat at the head of the boardroom table. I looked at Elias and Camille and the rest of my legal team. I told them excellent work. I told them to initiate the next phase of the Urban Renewal Initiative and to ensure our minority business grants were fully funded and operational by the end of the quarter. We were not just acquiring land. We were building a sustainable ecosystem for actual Black entrepreneurs who needed the capital that people like Connor usually stole from them. As the meeting progressed smoothly into the evening, I leaned back in my chair and looked out the massive windows. The sky had turned a deep velvet blue, and the city lights of Atlanta began to sparkle like a sprawling sea of diamonds. The view from the top was breathtaking, but it was the silence that I cherished the most. Society demands that Black women act as the eternal shock absorbers for their families. We are conditioned from birth to be the strong ones, the mules who carry the trauma, the debt and the shame of the people who share our blood. We are told that loyalty means setting ourselves on fire to keep our relatives warm. My mother and father expected me to absorb their cruelty and finance their illusions simply because they gave me life. But I rejected their script. I realized that the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to participate in her own destruction. I let them call me a failure. I let them mock my modest warehouse. I let them exclude me from their gala. I endured their laughter because I knew a fundamental truth about power. True power does not need an audience. It does not need a magazine cover or a country club membership. Power is the ability to dismantle your enemies with a single email and still sleep soundly 8 hours a night. The collapse of Aura Sync and the federal indictment of Connor were necessary actions. They were the surgical removal of a cancer that threatened my assets and my peace. But watching my toxic family lose their social standing and their fake wealth was never the ultimate goal. Vengeance is a temporary satisfaction. It is a fleeting rush of adrenaline that fades the moment the dust settles. The real victory was right here in this room. The true payoff was not destroying the people who doubted me. It was building an empire they could never touch. It was knowing that my financial security, my emotional health, and my legacy were locked behind a vault they did not have the combination to open. I looked around the table at my found family. I listened to the calm, intelligent flow of their strategies and projections. I had built a fortress of absolute peace. My parents could stand outside the gates and scream until their voices gave out, but they would never breach the walls again. Isabella could spend the rest of her life blaming me for her downfall, but she would have to do it from a tax bracket that no longer concerned me. I turned my gaze back to the glowing Atlanta skyline. I took a deep, clean breath of the crisp, climate controlled air. I had paid my dues. I had survived their cruelty, and now finally I was going to enjoy the profound, untouchable peace of the penthouse.